So some things we need to think about. Number one, we really don't differentiate between full-time and part-time work. And that's a problem, because if everybody in the country switched from being full-time to being part-time, the unemployment rate would not go up. So if you want the unemployment rate to recognize what's really going on in your economy, it doesn't, in the sense that full-time, part-time, right? During the Great Depression, lots of people were moved from full-time to part-time. Here in Vegas in 2007, 8, and 9, lots of workers in the casinos went from, well, full-time to part-time, or they had their hours cut, or they went from, the call-in board instead of being a regular employee. Those people don't really show up. The part of what happens in the CPS is they ask you how many hours you worked. So they keep track, the government's keeping track, and there's a separate table, a separate thing that they report that would tell you that the number of hours people were working on average had gone down. Okay? You're fired from your job. Okay? You're unemployed. Every day for 2 years, every day you go out looking for a job and you don't find one. You just look and you look and you look and you don't find one. So on your second anniversary of losing your job, you wake up in the morning, you look at your significant other and you go, done, not looking for a job anymore. Your significant other can then reach out, pat you on the back and go, great job, you're not unemployed anymore. As soon as you stop looking, you're not unemployed. So if you give up, if you've been looking for a long time and you give up, you're not unemployed. Now we have a name for you, which is discouraged worker. Well, I don't think these people are particularly discouraged. I don't think that's the word I would use. And they're not workers. That's the whole point. But we call them discouraged workers. In Nevada, 2007, 8, 9, the unemployment rate actually started to go down when the number of jobs in town was actually still going down. And the reason was people were stopping looking. People realized they couldn't find a job, and they just gave up looking. That means that those people are no longer considered unemployed. They're not in the labor force. Okay? And we'll talk about that more in a second. We have this, when you hear the unemployment rate, when somebody says the unemployment rate is blah, 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 blah. We have the lowest unemployment rate. And there's actually 6 unemployment rates. And the one that we use that's the official unemployment rate is U3. U3 is the percent of the labor force that's unemployed. Some of the other definitions of unemployment, if you go down to U5 and U6, they actually try to figure out how many discouraged workers there are and put those discouraged workers into those unemployment rates. So when the unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate was, 4% over the last few months, before the pandemic stuff all hit, U5, U6 might be 8%, 9%. Much higher, because they're trying to count these people who are discouraged workers, or what they say marginally connected to the labor force. There's all these other things that are in all these other U's. Okay? So here's some data. Let's look at some data. So the day that I did this, the estimate of the U.S. population is 329,721,000 people. Okay? The civilian non-institutional population is 259,869,000. That means that about 70 million people in the United States, let me say that again, about 70 million people in the United States are either under 16 or institutionalized. 70 million. Okay? Then the labor force is only 156,481,000. That means 103 million people are not in the labor force. You have 103 million people in the United States that are 16 and over, don't have jobs, and aren't looking. 103 million people. Now, some of those, again, are retirees. So if you're 80, you're retired, you're driving your RV around America, you're not in the labor force, you're one of those 103 million. The point of that is that the U.S. potentially has tens of millions of workers. When World War II came and we took, millions of men and we put them overseas, we actually increased production. We went from one shift a day in a lot of factories to 2 or 3 shifts a day, and they worked 7 days a week, and they did all this stuff. Well, they could do that because you had all of these workers, women who were at home, and all of a sudden now we got them out of the labor force. Old folks who came back and went into the labor force. So you had these people who were not in the labor force, and now they're in the labor force. Okay? Of that 156 million in the labor force, 133 million of jobs, and 23 million of them are unemployed. In April, this is April 2020. I use that number because that's such a wild, bizarre number that it just makes makes for more fun, unless you're one of those 23 million people. Just saying. All right, so the labor force participation rate is a number that we calculate. It tells us how many people are actually in the labor force out of the possible people. So we take the labor force, we divide it by the civilian non-institutional population. It's 156 million over 259 million. That's 60.2%. So only 60% of the people who could be in the labor force actually are in the labor force. And that number is down a little if you look at over time, used to be 63, 64. It's interesting because the participation rate for women is going up, which means the participation rate for men is going down, and actually down faster than the participation rate for women is going up. I don't know what that means. All right, so U3, the official unemployment rate, is the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. So that's 23 million divided by 156 million. That's 14.7% is the unemployment rate in April 2020. In March 2020, it was 7 million unemployed divided by 162 million in the labor force, which is 4.4%. So let's look at two things that happened. In 1 month, 6 million people left the labor force. So in 1 month, 6 million people went from being either employed or unemployed, they were in the labor force, to just being not in the labor force. They disappeared. Okay? They don't have jobs, they're not looking for jobs. 6 million people left the labor force. Then, on top of that, 14 million people lost their jobs. So you have, or 15 million people lost their jobs. So you got 15, 16 million people lose their jobs. You got another 6 million left the labor force entirely. If those 6 million people had stayed in and were added to the unemployed, then the unemployment rate would be higher than it is. Okay? The unemployment rate's lower because all those people left the labor force. Okay? Exciting? Yeah, it's exciting. So 4.4, we'll talk about that in a minute. We also have the employment population ratio, which is just the number of employed people over the population. That's 133 million, or that's 51%. Okay? So if we look at the civilian non-institutional population, the people who could have jobs, 51% of them do. So again, we have this huge group of people out there who we could call upon in an emergency and put to work. Beautiful graph of the unemployment rate. Beautiful graph. You can see this starts only back in the 40s, so it's only since the early Truman administration. You can see as we go along here that unemployment rate is occasionally high. You can see that here in the 50s it went down to 2.5%. So if somebody tells you we're at the lowest all-time unemployment, that's just nonsense. And if we went back into this and went back further, you'd find that in the 40s the unemployment rate was actually less than 2.5%. But then it goes up, and here it is at 11 in the 80s, and then slowly works its way down, so that in 2000 it's down to 3.5 or so. Then it bounces up again during the recession, goes down, and then look at this. That increase right there, that April 2020 increase, is the largest increase in 1 month in the unemployment rate in American history. Bigger change in the unemployment rate in 1 month than's ever happened in the history of the United States. Okay, this is earnings. This is how much money we make during the week. And earnings, last month's earnings haven't come out, so we don't know. This is what people get paid. And you'll notice that, again, if we look at the 50s, 60s, 70s, sort of bounces around, and then it goes up in the 90s when Bill Clinton's president, and then it levels out again through Bush, and then toward the end of Obama it starts to go up again, and then, except for that bounce, it was going up again under Trump. Okay? Weekly earnings. This is black unemployment. Now you should notice over here on the left, start over here on the left, here, that it starts in 1972. So when somebody says to you, hey, we have the lowest black unemployment ever, that's nonsense. Because we've only been tracking it since 1972. We didn't track unemployment among black folks in the 50s and 60s and 40s when the rest of the country had really low unemployment. So we don't know what unemployment among black folks was in the past because we didn't bother to calculate it. Which, if that says, why would they? Well, think about the world in the old days. But they didn't look at black unemployment. So we don't know what black unemployment was like before the 70s. And all unemployment rose sharply during the 80s and then came back down slowly, went back up, came back down. Okay? So, and then we have the bump up. And if you do the math, you know that bump up for black unemployment is actually higher, and we'll go through some of that numbers, but higher than for white folks. Why should you go to college? Well, in April 2020, the unemployment rate for people who didn't graduate high school is 21.2%. 1 in 5 high school dropouts in the United States is unemployed. A month ago, it was 6.8, which is still pretty high. You graduate from high school, you never go to college. Currently, your unemployment rate is 17.3, and a month ago, it was 4.4. You got some college or you went to a community college. Those people have an unemployment rate of 15% last month, or April 2020, 3.7 in March. College graduates, 8.4% unemployment. And you go, well, yeah, okay. That's high, but it's half of the unemployment for people who went to the community college, right? A little under. It's less than half of the unemployment rate for people who graduated from high school but didn't go to college. And it's, a little over a third of the unemployment rate for people who are high school dropouts. In March, it was 2.2%. College graduates had a 2.2% unemployment rate. And it jumped all the way up to 8.4. Okay? So there was a 6-point increase in the college graduate unemployment rate. There was a 15-point increase in the high school dropout unemployment rate. Okay? Stay in school. Unemployment by race. The overall unemployment rate is, for white folks, 14.2, for black folks, 16.7, for Asian folks, 14.5, and for Hispanic, 18.9. So again, this unemployment has hit black and Hispanic folks harder than white and Asian folks. It's everybody hard, but harder. Black and Hispanic unemployment was already 1.5 times white or Asian unemployment in March, and then it takes the biggest jump in April.